Hello everyone, my name is Thomas Müller. I have been following the stories shared here for many years, and after much reflection, I have finally decided to share my experience. Today, I am 62 years old, but it all began about 5 years ago when I was still serving as an auxiliary bishop. Back then, my life was very different from what it is today. I would frequent palaces and attend private political meetings. I had a personal driver and found myself in ornate rooms adorned with crystal chandeliers, regularly conversing with influential figures, from European politicians to leaders of the Vatican. For many, this life seemed filled with glory, luxury, and prestige. Yet behind that diplomatic smile and that impeccable robe, I was the only one who knew how empty I felt, detached from the faith that had guided me until then. I had lost my connection with God without even realizing it, and I had become so accustomed to wearing a mask that I could no longer remember my true self. During my childhood in the small village near Rosenheim, there was no trace of such luxury or influence. My father, a carpenter with cracked hands, spent hours in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of fresh wood and sawdust, while my mother devoted herself to selling colorful and fragrant flowers that she lovingly grew in our garden. I vividly remember the small altar she would simply prepare near violets and geraniums, with a modest statue of the Virgin Mary, and flickering candles that swayed in the late afternoon breeze. That altar represented for me a sweet and simple comfort in the face of the economic hardships we faced almost daily. My mother's faith was tangible, present in everyday life, and expressed through small gestures. Growing up, I admired all of this, and perhaps that's why, at 14, I decided to serve God. I entered the seminary, fueled by the hope of discovering something greater and helping my family escape the poverty I wanted to leave behind. Back then, I could never have imagined that this decision would take me so far and at the same time distance me so much from who I really was. In the early years at the seminary, everything seemed clear and straightforward. I would wake up early, attend morning prayers, help out in the kitchen, and spend the rest of the day immersed in books and theology lessons. It was a demanding routine, but within it was a purity that brought a joy hard to put into words. My companions came from similar backgrounds. Most were from small towns, children of farmers or laborers, young men like me searching for a vocation that could give meaning to our lives. I remember Stephen, my best friend from that time, who was from a village in the Spanish mountains. Stephen was a bit older, with a curious gaze and a contagious laugh. We would spend hours discussing the gospel, imagining the kind of priests we would become, and dreaming of the change we would bring to our communities. Stephen had an infectious enthusiasm, as if he truly saw God in everything, in the trees swaying outside, in the verses of scripture, even in the stories told by the old priests at the end of meals. During that time, I felt that the priestly life was a clear and bright path, with the cross as our guide. Years passed, bringing promotions, relocations, and new responsibilities. After my ordination, I was assigned to larger and larger parishes until my reputation led me to a position in the diocesan curia. From that moment on, it was only a matter of time before I was appointed auxiliary bishop, a role that put me in direct contact with the Vatican. This advancement stirred within me a confusing mix of pride and unease. On one hand, it was recognition for the work I had done since I was young. On the other, I began to realize how heavy and bureaucratic that structure was, far removed from the simple people I knew in the village where I grew up. Instead of confessing my sins, I found myself reviewing financial reports. Instead of proclaiming the gospel, I was caught up in negotiating deals with businesses and politicians. Gradually, my heart grew hardened and numb. The spiritual conversations I treasured so much with Stephen were replaced by talks about how to attract wealthy donors or maintain influence in certain circles. God, who once felt so close to me, had become a distant idea, a name I spoke but no longer truly connected with. It was during that time I realized something inside me was slipping away, even if I found it hard to admit. At this point in my life, I set out on a journey to the Austrian Alps, a pastoral assignment I initially saw as just another duty. My schedule was packed, and honestly, that trip felt like a minor detail compared to all my other responsibilities. I arrived in a remote village, where towering mountains seemed to touch the sky, and the air was so pure it almost stung my lungs. The people waiting for me in the small town square were mostly elderly, their faces marked by time and hardship. They all carried rosaries worn from use, and somehow their gazes struck me unexpectedly. There was a sincere and palpable faith there, a devotion so direct and genuine that it challenged everything I had become. Still, I went through the motions. I took part in the ceremonies, spoke words that felt almost automatic, then quickly returned to my room to get back to my routine. It was then that I met Frau Elisabeth. She was among the faithful who greeted me after Mass, a tall, slender woman with white hair that floated like cotton in the air. There was something in her look, a mix of kindness and challenge. When she approached, she didn't say anything unusual, but offered me a small homemade piece of bread, as she did with all guests, and smiled. Just as I was about to thank her and move on, she paused and asked in a calm yet firm voice, "Do you still believe in Jesus?" I was stunned. It was nowhere near the question I expected, and above all, I didn't expect it to come in such a peaceful tone. Lost for words, I muttered a vague reply about Christ's love and hurried away. Yet, those words stayed with me all night. Sitting alone in the chapel, with the sound of the bells echoing through the mountains, I cried for the first time in years. The silence of that night wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. The stars shone brighter than ever, a tapestry of light against the dark sky, and the surrounding mountains looked like giant sleepers. I sat on an ancient wooden bench inside the chapel, illuminated only by a few flickering candles. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, yet at the same time, my thoughts felt crystal clear. The words of Frau Elisabeth echoed in my mind like the sound of a distant bell. "Do you still believe in Jesus?" What struck me was not just the question itself, but the almost disarming straightforwardness with which it was asked. For the first time in a long while, I found myself forced to reflect on who I had become, to see clearly that I was living a life of appearances. My faith, once a raging torrent, had now dwindled to an almost dried-up stream, hidden beneath layers of political obligations, pompous speeches, and a routine that left my heart numb. Suddenly, a childhood memory resurfaced, vivid as if it were happening right then. I was a 7-year-old child, sitting on the kitchen floor while my mother sang an old hymn. She was mixing flour to make bread, and her voice filled the cramped room, creating an atmosphere of almost tangible peace. I remember how the morning light filtered through the window, resting on the flowers on the table, while the smell of yeast filled the air. In that moment, as a child, I was certain that God was present. It was a simple yet profound feeling. Reflecting on that moment in the chapel, I felt a deep sense of shame. When had I lost that awareness of the divine presence? Why had I replaced that innocent and pure certainty with layers of pride, manipulation, and deceit? As tears streamed down my face, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was truly praying, not with elaborate phrases or memorized words, but with a silent lament, a question rising from the depths of my soul. Lord, what has happened to me? I stayed in the chapel late into the night, as the candle closest to me burned down slowly and silently. The wooden bench creaked with every movement, as if sharing the emotional weight pressing down on me. At a certain point, I realized that I had no desire to return to my accommodation or face the obligations of the next day. Something inside me longed for a moment of true surrender, a kind of reconciliation I wasn't sure was still possible. I tried to remember if, in previous years, I had ever felt God's presence as I did that night. It wasn't a pleasant feeling, but a necessary pain, as if a wound was finally being exposed to the light. All the certainties I had built over time, titles, relationships, the respect of others, offered me no comfort now. There, alone among the mountains, I was reduced to a man stripped of all pretense, confronted with the raw and inescapable truth of my spirituality. The next morning, I ran into Frau Elisabeth again, this time at the small village market. She didn't mention our conversation from the night before, but greeted me with a warm smile, as if she knew exactly what I had experienced during those hours of solitude. I, on the other hand, felt an irresistible urge to tell her something, to open up about my feelings, but my upbringing and the desire to hide my vulnerabilities held me back. I bought some fresh bread, a few eggs, and a piece of cheese. Just as I turned to leave, she gently placed her hand on my arm and said, "It's lovely when we find answers, isn't it?" Her voice held an unexpected sweetness. I said nothing. I simply nodded and continued on my way, but deep down, I felt as though she had given me permission to keep searching, not for the answer I thought I needed, but for the one my eager heart truly required. As the days passed, the village embraced me in a silent warmth. It felt as though the place had a soul, a presence inviting me to reflect without rush, to reconsider my choices. Walking along the narrow paths, surrounded by majestic mountains and the constant rustle of the wind, became part of my daily routine. It wasn't just about appreciating the natural beauty, but a quest, an attempt to rediscover my identity before everything became complicated. Every time I crossed the small wooden bridge over a crystal-clear stream, I paused to contemplate the flowing water. I imagined I could free myself from the doubts, fears, and memories that weighed me down. I began to rediscover emotions I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not the naive kind that everything would just fall into place, but a spark suggesting that maybe I could reclaim what I had lost. During one of those walks, I met Frau Elisabeth for the last time. She was sitting on a stone bench beside a flower garden, holding a rosary in her hands, the beads so worn they looked like wax. Her eyes, despite the signs of age, shone with a liveliness that contrasted with her fragile frame. When she noticed me, she motioned for me to sit next to her. We stayed quiet for a while, watching bees flit from flower to flower. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but unwavering. She knows that the Lord has never abandoned her, right? It was she who built walls around her heart. Her words hit me like lightning. There was so much truth in them that I couldn't find the words to respond. I simply nodded, letting the silence carry what I felt inside. From that moment, I realized my search wasn't just for God, but for a heart free of barriers. And that required more than just reciting prayers or attending formal ceremonies. It called for a profound transformation. Over time, I began to take notes in a small notebook I always carried with me. It wasn't a traditional diary, but a place where I jotted down thoughts, reflections, and memories that surfaced during my walks. I wrote about childhood memories, mornings spent in my father's shop, and evenings with my mother by the altar. I also recorded seminary days, late-night study sessions with Stephen, and the passionate homilies I prepared with such dedication. But I didn't shy away from noting the times I felt lost, the meetings where I signed papers I didn't fully understand, the fancy dinners where I swallowed my conscience along with the soup. Each filled page was like a mirror, reflecting who I had been and how I had grown. At first, those memories were painful, but gradually they began to illuminate the path I needed to follow. It was while flipping through one of those pages on a particularly cold night that the idea of reaching out to Stephen came to me. We hadn't spoken in years, ever since he left the seminary before being ordained. I remembered his occasional letters where he spoke of a faith that went beyond dogmas and structures, nourished by the simplicity of the gospel. Back then, I read his words with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. But now, I felt an almost desperate urgency to hear his voice. Not knowing where to start, I reached out to some old friends, sent emails, and finally tracked down a phone number. When Stephen answered, his voice sounded incredibly familiar, as if I was stepping back in time. He welcomed me warmly, asking no questions and passing no judgment, simply showing a genuine willingness to listen. That meeting was the first step in realizing that my return to Christ would not be a journey I took alone. I found Stephen in a small chapel on the outskirts of a village that, by comparison, made my own hometown feel like a bustling city. The chapel was simple: rough wooden benches, bare walls, and windows that let in the morning light without the filter of stained glass. Stephen greeted me with a peaceful smile and a contentment I immediately envied. As I approached, he raised his hand in a warm greeting and said, "Thomas, welcome. I'm truly glad you're here." Without any formalities, he led me to the modest altar and invited me to sit down. "We don't have much here," he said, gesturing around us, "but we have everything that really matters." To my surprise, he then began to share how his journey had led him to step away from the institutional church, but not from faith itself. He spoke of a time when he felt lost, only to find a living Christ among people, in their actions, in selfless love. His words struck me in a new way. They weren't theoretical or political, but deeply human, close and authentic. As he spoke, I noticed something curious. I didn't feel envy for his happiness, but hope, the hope that I too could find the peace and the Christ he described. We talked for hours that day, walking along paths around the chapel, stopping beside a small stream where he told me about a day when, washing his face in that water, he felt freed from the masks he had worn for years. "It wasn't about rules," Thomas said. "It was about the heart, that heart which allows God to find it." Those words stayed with me as I returned to my accommodations that evening. For the first time, the cassock I wore felt lighter, not because I had resolved all my struggles, but because something inside me had shifted. The weight of doubt and pride hadn't completely disappeared, but it no longer defined me. From that moment on, I began to see my duties differently. I continued to serve as an auxiliary bishop, but something inside me had changed. It wasn't a radical or immediate transformation, but rather a small crack in the barrier I had built around myself. Instead of approaching each Mass or meeting as a mechanical ritual, I started to notice the faces around me, the expressions of genuine faith, the hands lifted in sincere prayer. In every parish I visited, I made it a point to spend some time with the people after Mass, listening to their stories and asking about their lives. It was a simple yet powerful way to remind myself why I had embarked on this path. Soon enough, this raised suspicions among some colleagues. Someone skeptically remarked, "What's happening to Thomas? He's acting strangely, as if he wants to go back to being a village priest." But for the first time, those comments didn't bother me. It was in this context that I started to write more openly about my experiences. I wrote for myself in notebooks that I hid in the deepest drawer of my desk. In those notebooks, I recorded the feelings I had during Mass, what I saw in people's eyes, the little epiphanies that came to me while walking among the mountains or sitting silently before the tabernacle. Each filled page was a way to open a door for God to enter again. I didn't publish anything, but the act of writing helped me remember who I really was. One night, after a peaceful Mass in a village even smaller than the first, I opened one of my notebooks and for the first time asked myself if it was finally time to share what I held inside with someone else. After all, I knew well that those words couldn't remain a secret just for me. They needed to reach other people somehow. I still wasn't sure how to go about it. Shortly after making this decision, something unexpected happened. Stephen invited me to a small private gathering with his community. It wasn't an official celebration or a public event, but just a few families coming together in a simple home to pray and share their experiences. When I arrived, I was met with warm smiles and genuine handshakes, as if I'd always been part of that group. We sat on ordinary chairs around a modest table. Children ran around the small space. The elders exchanged stories, and at one point, Stephen suggested we sing an old hymn I hadn't heard since childhood. The melody was simple, but the sincerity in the voices around me was something I hadn't felt in years. I was overwhelmed by an almost paralyzing emotion. Through that song, I realized their faith was authentic, not bound by rules, but by something real, alive, naturally flowing from their hearts. That night, I returned to my lodging feeling both calm and unsettled. Calm because I had finally encountered something genuine, something I'd been searching for without even knowing it. Unsettled because I knew this experience challenged everything I had built over the years. I stayed up late, windows open, the cool mountain breeze drifting in. In the distance, church bells marked midnight. I grabbed one of my notebooks and began writing like never before, almost trance-like. The words flowed effortlessly, revealing truths I hadn't dared face, even with myself. When I finished, I closed the notebook with a deep sigh. There was an element I could no longer ignore. I couldn't live in illusion any longer. I felt the need to find a way to be true to this new understanding, to follow what my heart knew was right, even if it meant making sacrifices. I decided it was time to be honest, even if it put my position at risk. Slowly, I started to change my behavior, not suddenly, but enough for those around me to notice. I stopped attending several meetings I knew were merely power plays. I began to express myself more openly during the sermons, no longer fearing the reactions of some influential figures. I replaced diplomatic, generic topics with sincere reflections on faith and love. People noticed the difference. Some members of the community approached me to thank me, saying they appreciated hearing more honest words from the pulpit. Others, however, kept their distance, probably because they didn't fully understand what was happening. And in the silence, whispers began to spread. My superiors initially tried to dissuade me indirectly. "Thomas, you should follow the protocol. There's no need for such radical changes," they said. But something inside me had already shifted enough that I couldn't turn back. It was in this atmosphere of tension that I made a crucial decision. Recording a video wasn't an official statement, but a personal testimony. In it, I shared my journey starting from my seminary years, the gradual detachment I had felt, and the unexpected reconnection I found in that small village. I spoke about how lost I had felt within the institution and how God, through simple people like Frau Elisabeth and Stephen, had called me back to a genuine relationship with him. When I finished recording, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I sent the video to a few acquaintances, and unexpectedly, it began to spread. Soon, the video reached people I never would have imagined. I received messages of encouragement from those touched by my story. Others, however, criticized me harshly, accusing me of betrayal or losing my way. In that moment, I understood there was no turning back. The video quickly spread beyond my diocese, reaching other countries. Some interpreted my confession as a call for reform, while others viewed it as an open denunciation of the Church. I received numerous invitations for interviews and events, but I declined every one. My intention had never been to become a public figure or a symbol of protest. In truth, my only wish was to share my experience, to tell what God had done in my life. However, the consequences were inevitable. The Vatican sent an official summons, asking for my presence to discuss what I described as a renewed encounter with Christ. They were formally polite, but the tone was clearly one of warning. When I arrived at the meeting, I found a group of clergymen waiting for me with stern faces. Sitting before them, I felt the weight of the institution pressing down on me like a mountain. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand why I had caused such confusion. I remained calm, even though my heart was pounding. I explained that my intention was not to create divisions or attack the church, but simply to share my story and the transformation I had experienced. I spoke about Frau Elisabeth, about Stephen, and the ordinary people who had rediscovered Christ in their lives and helped me find him. Some among them seemed moved by my words, though cautiously, as if unsure how to process them. Others remained rigid, arguing that my public approach had been reckless and that I should reconsider my statements. I refused to change what I had said, but was not confrontational either. A few months later, I decided to write an open letter, not to criticize the church or justify my choice, but to express the gratitude I felt for having found my way again. In that letter, I recounted how that period of crisis sparked by Frau Elisabeth's simple question had led me to reflect on my life and seek something more genuine. I shared the nights of tears in the chapel, my encounter with Stephen, and how I came to recognize God in every aspect of my surroundings. The letter was published in a small local newspaper and surprisingly received a much wider response than I had imagined. People from different places began contacting me, asking how they could have similar experiences. My answer was always the same. There is no formula. Seek the truth and be prepared to face the pain of looking within. Over time, I came to understand that my journey was not just personal. It was something that could inspire others to break free from the masks we wear in life, whether they be religious, social, or personal. Today, I live in a small house on the outskirts of the village, helping out at the chapel, working in the fields, and handling simple daily tasks. They no longer call me bishop or father, but that doesn't matter. The title has been replaced by something far deeper, the freedom to walk with Christ without filters or pretenses. I am simply Thomas, a man who has been given the chance to start over, and if this story touches anyone's heart, I hope it shows that it's never too late to return to the true love of God. If I were asked today whether I would do it all again, I admit I would hesitate. The path I've taken has been filled with pain and loss, but it has also led me to discover a living faith that makes every step worthwhile. I did not have a grand heavenly vision or a dramatic miracle that brought me back. A few months later, I decided to write an open letter, not to criticize the church or justify my choice, but to express the gratitude I felt for finding my way again. In that letter, I described how that difficult period, symbolized by Frau Elisabeth's simple question, pushed me to rethink my life and seek something more authentic. I spoke of nights spent crying in the chapel, meeting Stephen, and how I learned to see God in everything around me. The letter was published in a small local newspaper and resonated far beyond what I had imagined. People from many places began reaching out to ask how they could have similar experiences, and I always gave the same answer. There is no formula. Seek the truth and be ready to face the pain of looking within. Over time, I came to see that my journey was not just personal. It meant something that could inspire others to free themselves from the masks we wear in life, whether religious, social, or personal. Today, I live in a small home on the edge of the village, involved in the chapel, the fields, and simple everyday chores. They no longer call me bishop or father, but that doesn't matter. The title has been replaced by something far more meaningful: the freedom to walk alongside Christ without filters, without pretensions. I am simply Thomas, a person who had the chance to start over. And if this story resonates with anyone, May it serve as proof that it's never too late to return to the authentic love of God. If someone were to ask me today if I would do it all again, I'd have to admit I would still hesitate. The path I took was filled with pain and loss, but also with an encounter with a living faith that rewarded every step I took. There wasn't a grand heavenly vision or a dramatic miracle that brought me back. It was a simple question asked by a common woman at an unexpected moment. Moments like these can't be anticipated or planned, and maybe that's exactly why it felt so genuine. My encounter with Frau Elisabeth, with Stephen, and that little community didn't just mark a change in my life. It was a call to remember that God doesn't need grand structures or complex rituals to communicate with us. He uses what is ordinary, what is small, what is humble, and this has radically transformed my life. Now, when I return to walk among the mountains around the village, I sense a different atmosphere in the air. It's not a weight of guilt or loss, but something much lighter. It's the awareness that despite the hardships faced, I have rediscovered the heart of Christ, and this is what I want to share with those who read these words. I am no longer a bishop nor an authoritative figure. I am simply a man who rediscovers each day the meaning of being loved by God. And perhaps that's the quest for all of us, the assurance that it's never too late to let go of emptiness and return to fullness. Have you experienced events that have radically changed your perspective on life? Share your story or thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your reflections. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss new content that's coming. While you're here, click on the next recommended video you'll see on the screen. I'm sure it will inspire you even more. Thank you for watching and see you next time.